during the discussion. May I now request the last speaker, but certainly not the least, definitely, Arunara Das Mathur, Founding Dean, the Vedika Scholars Program.
Thank you. Everybody's spoken with a lot of data that already exists, and it's fascinating to see that an idea for the future might actually be rooted in what is already being discovered. I run a foundation along with the Vedika Scholars Program for Women, and I want to take a minute to talk about this, that a lot of the things that we hear are talking about issues that women face as they are experiencing their working life. And our idea was, how do we equip, even if it's a small group of women to start with, to walk into the workforce with the knowledge of a lot of the things that we are already talking about. The kind of mindset challenges that you will face, the kind of infrastructure that will come in your way, the kind of concerns that society puts out, the mindset challenges, all of those. So can we take a group of women who are 20, 22, 23, 24, and have them exposed to the kind of conversations that you and I got exposed to only in our 30s or late 30s. The success of executive education worldwide, where there are loads of colleges and universities now that are running programs for mid-career women, when you've already sort of stumbled to say, how can I correct the mistake? Can we bring that learning way forward into the early 20s so that you again make informed choices when you're at those crossroads where we did intuitive things because we were just exposed to a very different narrative. But the larger concept that I want to talk about today is an index that we are working on, where we are saying, can we inspire geographies, whether it's states, whether it is cities, whether it is countries, to actually recognize all of the things that have been spoken about and have them compete with each other to become the most attractive geographies for women. And it's not just working women, it is actually working families. I took this leaf out of Barack Obama's book. He did this fascinating conference at the White House 3 years ago, where he said the problem is not of working women. The problem is, what do we do for working families to feel good, successful, and satisfied in the way we approach our lives? And that's what got us thinking. And I realized that there are 3 big problems. The first is an awareness problem. There's very few people who even know the kind of things that we are hearing in this room. So what can we do about spreading awareness? The second is advocacy, and that's the big public policy question. And the third is really infrastructure. So how do you attract the attention of policymakers? You know, you can have a very interested, compassionate person come and talk, but it's very limited and it is not institutionalized. And my big problem in India is that the government of India only recognizes women as victims. So if you're not emaciated, if you're not malnutritioned, if you don't suffer from domestic violence, if you don't have 6 kids and you're not uneducated, the government really doesn't care about you. So how do we change the conversation and let people recognize us as assets? That I have the power to actually change the way the economy looks, society looks, the life for young women looks, and the life for men looks. We are living in a world today where women are kept out of the workforce and men are kept out of homes. So I do take away from the morning conversation that yes, this need is as much for women as it is for men. But in the world in which we live, where success is defined in the manner that it is, I think the more disadvantaged lot today is the woman. And therefore, we do have to take charge to bring the conversation center stage and bring more women into bring more men into the conversation. I don't think we can leave it to the benevolence and understanding of men to say, how can I make it better for my wife, for my daughters, for my daughter-in-law, for my sister, and for my mother. The interesting thing is that I think there are sparks of this conversation everywhere, and it gives us the confidence that the tipping point may not be that far. You know, whether it is advertisements, I don't know how many of you have seen this absolutely fascinating advertisement. I think it's by Titan, Ariel, where it's saying share the load. And if a man of 65 can change his mind and start sharing the workload with his wife, then I think there's a lot of hope that we can all live with. So our big need was to attract the attention of policymakers. And as an economist and as a person who watches all the research that's going on, I'm thinking, what is it that gets people, make them stand up and take notice? And indices actually have a very interesting role to play in attracting attention and creating healthy competition between people to get viewed in a certain way. So, there is, on a more serious note, the investment attractiveness of states. An initiative that I think was started by India Today 15 years ago, completely changed the way in which states look at themselves, and then you break down the parameters and you can create an opportunity and incentive for people to start working on those parameters that create a more conducive environment for becoming attractive to investment. States and cities are competing on how green they are, how many lakes they have, what color they are, all kinds of things. But if we can pull them to get a little bit more focused on saying, you know what, there are more women going through higher education today than boys. Their performances are better. If I look at, our program, the Vedika Scholars Program for Women has 40 really bright young women. They don't talk like the women that we are researching and talking about on these boards. So if you look at the younger generation, then the hope just goes up manyfold. That they are actually going to change the narrative, they're going to change the conversation. Their aspirations are not the aspirations that you and I had. They are more equal. My worry is that at 35, will they react like I did at 35? Right? I was a really independent-minded woman, but I did do many of the things that the previous generation did because I just didn't know better at those crossroads. So what can we do to make it easier for the younger women of today to not have to make the same mistakes, if you will, and live in a world that is just easier to work in? And with that in mind, we came up with something called the Working Women's Index. We may come up with a better name if somebody in the audience can suggest it. And we came up with 7 areas that are going to go into defining this index. We'd like to launch it and get, state chief ministers or city councillors to actually start competing to becoming the most attractive cities for young women, young men, and young couples to actually go and settle in. A quick dipstick survey showed that even in India, the big problem for women to drop out of the workforce is what it is across the world. It is childcare, it is elder care, it's a lot of domestic chores. Everybody says mindsets are really important. We believe that if you change the reality, you can change mindsets. So if there was actually good daycare available, which was safe and accessible and hygienic and affordable, I think the mindsets around putting your child into childcare would change far more rapidly than they would if we waited for people to feel better about a creche before starting them. So we are looking at the skills and qualifications. Some of these factors have come up in the pieces of research. That what is the education and skill that women have access to in a particular city? The second is the city robust and growing? So what are the economic opportunities? Because when opportunities are limited, men will still pip you to those jobs. The third is government and policy. So maternity, paternity, leave and wages, flexible hours, working from home, safety policies. I don't know how many of you know, but there's an attack on a woman and the government says, don't go to work after 7:30. Right? So how is the government thinking about making the environment safe for women to be out there? Domestic infrastructure, childcare, elder care, and domestic support, handyman, all of these kinds of services make it much easier for women to be out of the house. The city infrastructure, public transport, public toilets, healthcare support, and women's hostels. Talk to anybody in Delhi. It is impossible to work in this city because you can't find a place to live in. Safety, so police, women cops. There are lots of policies in place that say there are women cop stations, but they're not staffed. So some subjective parameters, that are there women cop stations? Are they responsive? What are the helplines like, and things like that. And finally, financial empowerment. Bank loans, bank accounts, property laws. I want to give you a small anecdote. I became financially independent at 19. I have worked and earned to be an independent woman for the last 25 years or 23 years, whatever it is. The bank does not give me a loan. Because I turned entrepreneur at some point, I had a checkered credit history. The bank will not give me a loan. I don't know how many people, the first time when I bawled at being rejected, not being given a loan, umpteen single women told me, try getting a loan, you won't get it. And the moment my husband stepped in to say, I'll guarantee the loan, the conversation shifted to talking to him, and the loan was sanctioned in 7 days. What is the chance that we can go out and be entrepreneurs or set up our own businesses or go out and pursue higher education if I don't have access to finance? So we do want to urge some bank to partner with us on a survey, which is nationwide, to say, what is the real access that women have to finance in this country? You want 3 years of returns or 3 years of profits before you will sanction me a loan. I can't get started. What can I do? So that's the index we are trying to develop. We are struggling with the data, but I hope that next year we'll be able to tell you which are the top 20 cities in this country for working women and working families. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. I think we'll all await the publication of that index, and as you said, cities are some of the most unsafe places for women to work in, at least our metropolitan cities, and one keeps hearing appalling incidents every now and then. Some research that ICRIER has done shows that, cities are going to be our engines of growth. And I think, the numbers are there in the public domain. 75% of our GDP is going to come from cities. 70% of net new jobs are going to be created in cities. So I think this is a wonderful idea to have an index, and it will, as you rightly said, set off some competition among cities, which will be quite positive in terms of creating that infrastructure and institutionalizing that change that so desperately needs to happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a question in reverse order to the panelists, and then I'll kind of open it up for discussion amongst the audience. And the question I wanted to ask Anuradha, which is related to what she said and I've just said, is that, in developing this index, you're likely to face enormous amounts of resistance, I think, political economy pressures. Who are the agencies in a city that you think you are going to reach out to create that awareness and to sensitize them? Which are the agencies that you think are going to be most important in trying to bridge this gap?
I think it's the challenge really is in framing your output. So I think if we framed it in a certain way, we would face resistance. I think if we framed it in a positive manner, there is a chance that we will get a lot of cooperation. So I think that's the first thing. And I think going against the establishment is just the worst way to achieve impact at scale. So we are quite clear that we would like to frame this in a manner that people are encouraged to participate. The Ministry of Women and Child at the center has offered to at least help try and get this data. But I think the big challenge in India is, more than the resistance, is that the data doesn't exist. The data that we would like to be a part of this index doesn't really exist in the manner that we want it. But I think places like UN Women, I'm fascinated to see what the McKinsey Global Institute is doing, what the IMF is doing. I think multilateral agencies, some government agencies, and I feel like municipal corporations could actually be incentivized to take the lead in terms of doing some of this stuff.
Thanks, Anuradha. And I think along with that, you will probably also want to try and build some capacity or help create capacity at the local level within government. Anu, I was struck by that number that you mentioned, that only 17% of the paid GDP is actually attributed to women. And that's something one always knew, but to put out that number is quite something. And do you find that there is a difference? You mentioned public and private sectors. Do you think there's a difference in your research you found in India between the gender sensitiveness and the outcomes, gender outcomes in public and private sectors? And given that it's private sector that is going to lead the way, we've seen a shrinking public sector in India. One anecdotally hears that public sector gender outcomes are perhaps better than the private sector, but it's the private sector that is going to kind of be dominant as India grows. So what, are the actions that private sector could take in trying to address these issues in the short term rather than in the long term?
Yeah, thanks, Rajat. I think that's, yes, the 17% is very striking. I think the double clicks you can do on that 17% are quite revealing. So the first double click, in a sense, is urban versus rural. And again, this is well known, but when you really think about it, it's quite a stunning fact that women's labor participation in India is so much lower in the urban domain than it is in the rural domain. You would normally think that with our cities, as you rightly said, being the engines of job creation and also being more prosperous and more dense, so the ability to provide infrastructure and services to support women's participation should logically be higher in cities. But these factors have not panned out. There are both, I guess, supply and demand and ecosystem issues which have actually kept women's urban labor force participation significantly lower than in rural areas. And I think if you think across the private sector, public sector, and let's say informal sector, which is the third sector of the economy, so to speak, you would find, we haven't sort of conclusively looked at the data, but you would find better gender outcomes in the public sector simply because of government jobs as well as education and healthcare being sectors that have traditionally absorbed more women. You would find, strangely, in the informal sector, you would find a higher gender balance, so to speak, because women are more represented in agriculture, more represented in informal retail trade. A lot of that is poverty-driven. A lot of that is driven because these are informal labor markets where education and skills and things like that are loosely defined, and a lot of them are rural. So for these reasons, the informal sector is better. And then you're left with the private sector, where it's really a pyramid. There are a small number of companies on the top, which I would say are cutting edge in terms of their diversity policies, but it has not percolated down to a larger base of companies. It has not percolated down to SMEs. I think we can use chambers of commerce and industry associations to drive more of this message as well.
Thank you, Anu. And I was very struck by the number that I don't remember the exact figure that you quoted, but even gender disparity in today's world, in Europe, at starting out wage levels, between the gap between males and females. And one would have expected that by now in Europe that would have been bridged, but I was struck by the gap. And you also said that gap persists, although it's declining, that gap persists. My question is, is awareness at a level where this can begin to be, addressed at the level of the company, or even at the level of the supply side? Can women or the people who are aspiring for these jobs, can they become more demanding in terms of the wages that they demand and deserve?
So there are. I think first of all, I think it's very important for each institution to realize what they are creating in terms of inequalities. And I think that it's very important to get the numbers. I think that one of major factor of change at my university has been getting these numbers out and realizing that there is a big problem, because until these numbers were out, people were saying, things are getting better, it's okay, we're doing well. Well, yeah, there's still a lot of things that we need to do. And with this research, we're starting training programs to help students actually enter the workforce, but with knowledge of how to tackle the issues. So yes, women can negotiate their wages there are techniques to learn how to negotiate wages. One of the reasons why women are uncomfortable negotiating wages, for instance, is that they're not used to doing that. And I think it's very important for universities around the world to consider that education is also meant to help women enter the workforce. It's not just giving knowledge from books. It's how will you be able to function and to develop your career once you're going to enter the workforce. So yes. Maybe one initiative that's very interesting, I think, is the Lean In initiative that has been started by Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO of Facebook. There's websites where they offer a lot of videos to help young women run through, issues that have to do with how are you going to manage a career with family life, how can you negotiate your wage, how can you show power and influence within a structure, and how can you be trained to do that? And I think that's very important to do within universities.
Thank you, Anne. And finally, Kalpana, you've been leading a lot of work at the IMF, and IMF is integrating it into policy advice and around the world, and you showed us examples during your presentation. What are the challenges that you face, and what is the kind of positive impact you think your research has had?
Thanks, Rajat. So I'll address that question, then I have a couple of comments on things that my fellow panelists said. So first on what the traction that the fund has gotten. First of all, it surprised us that there was an open audience for us. My sense is that, aside from the fact that our managing director is a very persuasive person, is that we were talking about these issues with finance ministers. Our interlocutors are finance ministers and central bank governors. They are not the human resources ministries or the labor ministries or they are not our traditional interlocutors. So for us to be raising these issues, I think, opened eyes in both good ways and bad ways, and I think it just sort of made people sit up and take notice. That's one, I think I would say, is a positive, actually. There are challenges. I think there are countries that are more receptive. Obviously, Japan, PM Abe made it part of his platform, and then we walked right into that and were able to contribute to that. In India, actually, the paper that I cited was part of our last consultation report with the Indian government, and it was extremely well received. What policies will be implemented and so on remain to be seen. Challenges, I wanted to also mention something about Saudi Arabia, where we did some work. And Saudi Arabia, you can imagine, is probably the least friendly environment in which to talk about this issue. But we, maybe by luck or maybe a little bit of foresight, but in the environment where they've had falling oil prices and a prospect of, a non-renewable resources being running out of this non-renewable resource at some point, I think has made them think much more seriously about diversifying their economies. And suddenly they are thinking, well, we should be moving into, sort of technology and digital world. And then there's women. And people have made the point, including us, that this is actually something that's very compatible with your social and religious and other sort of choices. You can still be an Islamic country that wants to keep, maintain its social norms, but you can have very productive workforce because these women can work in a home environment, connected to a computer, not actually out there, and so on. So the challenge is, I think, to find where the open doors are and push on them a little bit. And that's not easy always, but I think I'm actually been very pleasantly surprised by the reception we've gotten. Just a couple of comments on some things that people said at the table here. To Anuradha, I was thinking, we just finished a conference yesterday and the day before, organized by the IMF, called Advancing Asia. And one session was with Melinda Gates. And the whole time, all she talked about was measurement. All the time she said, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it, and all of those things, right? So my suggestion to you would be perhaps to contact people at the Gates Foundation to actually fund surveys that you can do, because, as you said, there is no data, and I'm not sure that governments, municipal governments, and however enlightened they might be, will of all the competing demands that they have, are going to put money into collecting information for you. It seems to me that either private companies or chambers of commerce, etc., but the Gates Foundation, since they're making such a big deal of gender and of data, including challenging the IMF to do better collection of gender responsive budget data and so on. And then one more comment on what Anu said about female labor force participation in India and rural. One of the striking facts is that female labor force participation is very high in sub-Saharan Africa, which might be surprising to you, but it's because it's poverty driven and it's because it's needs driven, and it's not the best jobs, it's really not productive jobs, it's very vulnerable, and this is on top of people, very high fertility rates, so women having 5, 6, 7 children and having to work. So it's not a good story, even though female labor force participation rates, as they're measured, are high.
Thank you, Kalpana. We'll again come back to some of these measurement issues, I'm sure, in the discussion. But we actually have, according to the time, we have 5 minutes, but I think Binu gave us some more flexibility and said you could go for 20. I will not be greedy. I will not take the entire 20. Let's say 15 minutes. 15 minutes. So we please I'll take questions in batches of, let's say, 3. Please be brief and identify the panelists you wish to ask the question of. Please be brief in the interest of time.
Hi. Good morning to everyone. My name is Anjana Anand and I work as an independent consultant in the development sector. It's not just a question, it's probably a request and a suggestion. Listening to such informative and awareness creating statistics and the pertinent issues that's bothering all of us related to the empowerment of women. Just from the policy point of view, can we look at making 8 hours official work hours mandatory for both men and women? So that will give men the time and to recognize the effort that is required to look after home, and women to give the time that they need to give. See, what I've seen in my experience of 20 years working in the corporate and development sector is that why women don't reach that position that we are talking about. At the entry level, there are a lot of women, and eventually it reduces, is that they are not able to give that much of 18 hours of work because they have work pressures at home. So there is another need. The need is to recognize that work pressure at home, which is of course very, very crucial for the society. They're doing the most important work of creating and rearing the future citizens of society, that is, children, taking care of the children and bringing them up. So can we look at making that 8 hours mandatory so that there are no 16 hours work? This is very, very, pertinent to India, I believe. Thank you.
Also, that's more in the nature of a comment, but I'll allow any of the panelists if they want to respond to that. Plus, please note the questions. I'll take one more question.
Hi, I'm Shashi Bala from VV Green National Labour Institute. I coordinate the activities of Center for Gender and Labour there. Let me start with the Anuradha. Welcome to the proposal of the executive training program for women entering the 20s. That is really going to help the women and the problems that the women face in 30s. But also important, taking the discourse from working women to the working families and linking to the ILO Convention 156 on work-life balance. Coming to the government recognitions, women as an asset, and there's a need as much for women as for men. There are laws, there are a lot of laws. The problem is like we have laws on night work, equal wages, maternity, child care, paternity leave, vehicle facility, creche facility, Social Security Act for women in the unorganized sector worker. There is no limitation to the laws, but the problem is training of the mindset of the implementers of the law. And linking it to the Anu's presentation, that is the mindset. And also important is to look into the India's population that is going to be the youngest population in the coming age, and women would be more in that. So it is really important. I would just brief about other presentations. Anu talked about the gender parity, via skilling and sharing unpaid care work, where the role plays a very important role, skilling and taking care of the unpaid care work, where mindset can play a very important role. You research talk about the graduates and the entry point labor force pattern. I would also suggest, why don't you take care about the retirement age of the women in your study, because the contribution to social security is less when the women are retiring at the early age. So and the life expectancy is higher among the women. That will add meaning to the research to your undertaking. And the last one, the first presenter talked about the Japan labor, the Japan maternity curve you talked about, the M curve that you talked about. Japan Labor Institute conducted this study on M curve. And this childcare facilities and childcare policies played a very important role in narrowing this M curve. But the latent labor force participation rate in women is an important challenge, considering the 92% of the women in the unorganized sector.
Thank you, Sashi. One more question, and then I'll turn back to the panelists. And we'll do another round, but please be brief. We have to start the next session.
Okay, thanks, Rajat. My name is Nirmala Menon, and I run a consulting organization called Interweave, which is into inclusion solutions. So everything that you said here on the panel resonated so clearly and so realistically for me. What I want to say here is that it's a very positive tone that private sector is investing a big deal in this. Yeah, a lot of things over the last 2 years have changed for organizations. Many of these programs on sensitization and helping people understand the need for diversity, bringing in policies around managing maternity, flexibility, all of that is becoming mandatory for a lot of organizations, and that's a very positive trend, because through the private sector, it can be a very powerful vehicle of change for society, because changing mindsets in organizations is changing mindsets in the society. So it's a very positive trend, and I think if we can push on the private sector, I think big changes can be expected in the short term.
Thank you. So let me start with Anuradha. Do you wish to respond to any question, implementation issues?
I didn't see the question. I thought most of them were comments, and so if there's anything specific.
Can I turn to any of the panelists if they want to say something? Yes.
Sure. I'd just like to react to the first comment around working hours. I think as McKinsey, we've also done very in-depth surveys across employees of companies, whether in Western Europe, in the US, all across Asia, from Japan and China, Southeast Asia and India. I think the single biggest barrier to women succeeding and becoming successful in terms of leadership positions, the single biggest barrier is what we call the anytime, anywhere culture that permeates work. So that point is well taken. But I think equally, the solutions have to be gender neutral. So the solutions have to be about promoting a culture which is more balanced for both men and women. And where that has happened, I think it's actually been successful, and men with the right role models are actually demonstrating that they are also eager to balance their own lives and be more equitable participants or partners in the home as well.
Yeah, I did. So on this work-life balance type issues and mandatory work days and so on, there has been experience. The Northern European countries have done it. They have mandated paternity leave, mandated. If you don't take it, you lose it. So this has really shifted significantly attitudes and participation rates. I think something that Isha said at the beginning, something about men and women, or maybe it was someone here who said, keeping women out of the workforce and men out of the home. This is really what was a game-changing reform in some countries. Korea is now trying it. It's probably a little bit harder to do in a society like Korea with sort of very entrenched attitudes amongst men and women. But if you start seeing changes there, then there's hope for all of us, I think. In terms of the private sector role, I think ICICI Bank is one that's really stood out. And as many of you might have seen the interviews with, I think done by you guys, with Chanda Kochhar. And so hopefully, again, there will be competition and more.
Anne, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I also wanted to react to the question about the 8-hour work week. So in France, we have our 8-hour work day. In France, our work week is 35 hours, actually. And what we find is that, and it's kind of, I think it's pretty much true of a lot of work that you can find in gender issues, is that when you create rules, women will respect the rules, and men much less. So men actually will work extra time and get a higher salary. And to some extent at my own university, that's one of the reasons why so this is on the employee side, why we have a gender wage gap among our employees is that the men are being paid extra time when the women aren't. We have also a way to, so like if women want to work part-time, and so what will often happen is that they'll work like 80% of the week, but they are on the one day where they're not supposed to be working, they're going to be working from home, nonetheless, sending emails, checking their emails, etc. Men, they're just going to work the whole week, even if they're not necessarily present at the workplace. So I'd be really wary about creating rules that would actually have as a consequence to penalize women who want to respect these rules.
Thanks. And, okay, we'll do one last round. I'll take 3 questions, then please be brief. Yes, please, there's a lady there, Simrit, I recognize. There's a lady right at the back there. Yes, please.
Hi. So basically I wanted to ask that...
By yourself? This is being recorded.
Rupali, I am coming from Bharti Airtel. So I just wanted to ask from Anuradha that historically men have been active on the economic front. Like even if you see kings and queens, kings were the one who were ruling the nations. So are we like convinced that this is the right way of society, that women should join the economic workforce? There should be policies around forcing, maybe forcing women into economics for development. Isn't it like historically, since this has been the case, shouldn't it be left on the families?
Thank you, Rupali. Simrit? Mike, please.
Yeah, I begin by complimenting all the panelists, Kalpana, Anu, Anne, and Anuradha, with a good moderator, Rajat. Largely, it's a form of observation that I would like to make. I've come from the University of Delhi, and some of our students are working on gender issues. Notwithstanding whatever you've said, I am with you, believe in that. But probably what I felt was that the culmination of gender equality is probably winding up when you talk about labor force participation rate, and you think of that as an end. However, there was a slide which showed there is a positive correlation between the moment you are participating in the labor force and society also recognizing your contribution more or less in an equal form. However, within the household level, what culminates is that even if you're financially independent, you don't have the independence of taking financial decisions. And this may or may not be so whether you're working or not. So probably corroborating your evidence with the empowerment to take financial decisions, irrespective of your working or not. And also then strengthening the argument and reinforcing it with the husband also saying, because sometimes we see that the female is saying, I don't have much of an empowerment, or I do have. And the male countering that and saying not necessarily, so I am the one who's the boss, or the other way. Also more on let's say, it's a kind of an enforcement. Rather than talking about a work balance, use of work balance, people are probably now talking about integrating of work with home. It's a psychological meaning, because balance means it's an either or and you have to now balance it. Integrating could be both together. And in the Indian context, it's more of, doing away with the MRTP Commission and moving to the CCI, Competition Commission of India, from an anti-monopoly to a pro-competition role, more or less, maybe still the same. Thank you so much.
That was, for the interest of the audio-visual recording, that was Professor Simrit Kaur. Okay, since there are no more hands up, I'm going to turn back to the panelists. Kalpana, starting with you.
I want to very quickly address the question about the question from the back about kings and queens. We are not, everything that all 4 of us have said is about leveling the playing field. Nobody is asking for advantages. Nobody is asking for anybody to be forced. We are saying that what is required is a level playing field in terms of opportunities, in terms of laws, in terms of policies. Once you have that level playing field, then you have actually the opportunity to make a choice whether you want to work or not. If you don't have a level playing field, it means you have an artificial restriction on your choice. Do you want to have a restriction on your choice?
Anu, would you like to? And Anuradha, would you like to make?
Yeah, I actually just want to, the core of the Foundation for Working Women says living your choice to work. And just to add to what Kalpana said, I think there are lots of artificial barriers to women who want to work. But as I work with young women, I think I'm happy to almost step out and be provocative and say, we have to bring up our young women to know that it is actually not a choice to be responsible for yourself or not. I don't know many men in my life who said, I don't like my boss, I quit my job. Most of the women I know walk back home one day because they don't feel like working anymore. Where is the equality in this world that we are demanding if it's okay for you to expect a father, a husband, a brother, a male friend to look after you all your life? And I think it is really in the narrative. I can give you examples from many, including my own. That I was brought up in a home which said be independent, be financially independent. It had never struck me that I should buy a house. And somebody just now mentioned a husband. If we look at the demography and the societal norms of the way people are going, who looks after you between 21 and 35? Or 28 or 30? We no longer live in a society where you can assume that because you were born a woman, you will be handed over from a father to a husband, and that husband will look after you and treat you well, and you will be married till you die. So I think somewhere women need to also, both men, women, most importantly fathers and brothers, need to recognize that you have to bring up a person who is capable of looking after themselves. If you have somebody else who adds to that, provides the jam, you have all the other support systems in the world, good luck. It's a bonus. But
thank you, Anuradha. I'm going to now conclude this panel. It's been a pleasure to having moderated this discussion. I'm going to make 3 telegraphic points, really telegraphic, stemming from what the panel has said, and especially what Kalpana said right at the end is, if you recall what Sherlock Holmes used to tell Watson, it's a capital sin to theorize without data. We need to start collecting data and improving the quality of our measurement for statistics around gender, and we will do that. And Kalpana has given us a good lead. We will begin to do that. I think measurement is half the battle. Then you can actually build awareness, which is the second thing that we need to do, awareness, advocacy. ICRIR is not an advocacy organization, but we build awareness through conferences like these. We put out research papers, and then thirdly, try and build a case for policy intervention. But as you know, designing policy is not the be-all and the end-all. In fact, as some of the speakers and the panelists have identified, it's designing policy, but I think policy includes implementation. For a long time in India, we think of policy as just design and leave it, but policy actually includes not only the rules, but also has to include, at the end of the day, implementation and enforcement, which has sorely been lacking in India. So I think we will do our bit: measurement, awareness, policy, implementation. And let me take this opportunity also to thank the distinguished panelists for having given us a riveting session and a rich discussion, and to all of you for having contributed to this. Kalpana, Anu, and Anuradha, thank you so much for the rich discussion.
Thank you, panelists, Dr. Kathuria, and audience. If the data shows that women add so much more to GDP and firm bottom lines, they're automatically making the world enough money to pay, to bridge the wage gap and to pay for social policy and then some. So it has to be bad economics and bad business to leave that much money and talent on the table. Moving very swiftly to our next session on gender balance in leadership, impactful actions needed to change the status quo. May I now invite to moderate our session Mr. Dilip Cherian, founding and consulting partner, Perfect Relations India, right after for pictures.